If you're honest with yourself, most people don't actually live in reality. They live in commentary, in interpretations, in stories running in their heads 24/7. And that's exactly why the world feels chaotic, hostile, unfair, and exhausting. Not because reality is broken, but because it's rarely seen. The first law of adequatism doesn't begin with comfort or motivation. It begins with an uncomfortable proposition. See things as they actually are, not as you wish them to be, not as your fears paint them, not as your habits distort them, but as they exist right now. It sounds simple, almost too simple to take seriously. And that's exactly the trap. Because the moment you truly start seeing reality, many familiar structures collapse. Excuses stop working, illusions lose their grip, and blaming the world becomes strangely difficult. The human mind is a brilliant storyteller and a terrible witness. It fills in gaps instantly, adds meaning where none exists, creates villains, victims, and disasters in seconds. Someone doesn't reply. The mind writes a full narrative. Someone speaks sharply. The mind assigns intention. Something goes wrong. The mind declares catastrophe. All of this happens so fast that it feels like you're reacting to life itself. But you're not. You're reacting to your interpretation of life. And this is where the first law of adequatism steps in. It doesn't argue. It doesn't comfort. It simply asks, what here is fact, and what is your interpretation?
A fact is neutral, dry, often boring, sometimes unpleasant, but never hysterical. An interpretation, on the other hand, is emotional, convincing, loud, and usually centered around the ego. Fact, a person didn't call back. Interpretation, I'm ignored, disrespected, unimportant.
Adequatism doesn't claim interpretations are always false. It claims something far more important. If you don't separate them from facts, you are not in control of your life. Most people live on autopilot. Stimulus, reaction. Word, emotional spike. Event, immediate conclusion. No space in between. The first law of adequatism restores that space. At first, it's small, almost unnoticeable. But inside that space lives freedom. Freedom to pause. Freedom to observe. Freedom to choose a response instead of firing a reflex.
The Stoics understood this centuries ago. It's not things that disturb us, but our judgments about them. Adequatism doesn't disagree. It turns that insight into daily practice. And here's the surprising part. When people genuinely apply this law, they notice something unexpected. Reality turns out to be less dramatic than their thoughts about it.
Fewer enemies, fewer disasters, fewer everything is ruined moments. More clarity, more precision, more calm strength. And yes, that can feel unsettling, because the familiar noise fades, and with it go old roles, habits, and comforting illusions. The first law of adequatism doesn't make you happy. It makes you clear-headed. And clarity is the foundation of everything else. Without it, every philosophy becomes decoration. With it, even simple actions become powerful. This is only the beginning. When the first law of adequatism actually starts working, the change is subtle at first. Nothing explodes, no dramatic enlightenment. What changes is your internal tempo. Thoughts slow down, reactions lose their urgency, and a pause appears where none existed before. That pause is everything.
Adequatism doesn't ask for belief. It asks for verification. That's why it relies less on inspiration and more on discipline. One of the foundational practices of the first law is observing thoughts, not controlling them, not suppressing them, not fighting them. Observing. Most people live as if every thought were a command. A thought appears, and action follows. A feeling arises, and behavior obeys. Adequatism breaks that reflex. It teaches you to see thoughts as mental events, not truths. Temporary, contextual, often outdated.
A thought can say, "I'm being disrespected." Adequatism responds calmly. Is that a fact or a conclusion? And sometimes, when you slow down enough to look honestly, you realize nothing actually happened. No attack, no insult, no threat. Just a neutral situation amplified by habit.
Another essential practice is reaction control. Not emotion control, reaction control. Adequatism doesn't say, don't feel anger. It says, don't let anger act for you. Emotions can be intense, sharp, uncomfortable. But between emotion and action, you can install a pause. Sometimes that pause lasts half a second, sometimes several seconds, sometimes an entire evening. That pause saves conversations. It saves decisions. It saves reputations. And sometimes relationships. In high-pressure situations, this skill becomes critical. When everything inside demands immediate reaction, adequatism insists on one thing first: establish reality. What exactly happened? What was said? What was done? No labels, no judgments, no inner courtroom. This principle is used by people who cannot afford emotional mistakes: negotiators, analysts, crisis psychologists, those whose decisions carry real consequences. It's not about being cold, it's about being precise. Another key practice of the first law is entering the observer's position. This is not detachment from life, it's a shift in perspective. You step slightly back and look at the situation from the outside, at yourself, at the other person, at the dynamics between you. From this position, many things become obvious. What felt like a personal attack now looks like poor communication. What seemed like hostility turns out to be clumsiness. What felt like disaster reveals itself as a manageable mistake. In business, the first law of adequatism is ruthless. It doesn't allow prolonged self-deception. It strips away explanations and returns you to results. There is performance, or there isn't. There is demand, or there isn't. There is growth, or there isn't. The market isn't cruel, it's real. And adequatism teaches you not to argue with reality, but to work with it. In relationships, the first law is even more uncomfortable. It forces you to look at actions instead of promises, behavior instead of potential, consistency instead of hope. If someone repeatedly shows you who they are and you keep believing something else, that's not love. That's refusal to see reality. Over time, practicing the first law leads to a striking realization. The world didn't become harsher. People didn't become worse. You just stopped lying to yourself, and that changes everything. Over time, something subtle but profound begins to happen. Reality stops feeling oppressive, not because it has softened, but because you've stopped fighting it. The first law of adequatism slowly rewires the architecture of perception itself. You no longer rush to assign blame. You stop clinging to comforting explanations. You ask fewer emotional "why me" questions, and more grounded "what is actually happening" ones. This shift may look small from the outside, but internally it is radical. Here's an important distinction. Adequatism is not emotional suppression. It's not detachment from life, and it's certainly not turning yourself into a cold machine. Emotions remain. They still rise. They can still be intense, sometimes painful, but they are no longer in charge. Adequatism doesn't say don't feel. It says don't confuse feeling with reality. This distinction alone changes everything. Most people believe that if they feel something strongly, it must be true. Adequatism corrects this gently but firmly. The feeling is real. The conclusion may not be. This is where adequatism differs sharply from many modern philosophies and self-help movements. It doesn't ask you to think positively. It doesn't ask you to manifest a better reality. It doesn't ask you to simply accept everything and call it peace. Adequatism asks for something more demanding: clarity. The first law of adequatism proves its power not in theory, but in everyday decisions. You speak less unnecessarily. You react less impulsively.
You recognize manipulation faster. You conserve mental energy instead of wasting it on imaginary battles. The first law becomes especially valuable in an age of constant stimulation. Too much information, too many opinions, too many emotional triggers competing for your attention. Adequatism quietly asks a simple question: what here actually matters? And suddenly, much of what once felt urgent loses its grip.
Another unexpected effect appears over time. You become difficult to manipulate. People struggle to provoke you, to pull you into drama, to hijack your emotional reactions, because you no longer live inside their interpretations, or your own unchecked ones. You verify, you observe, you see.
The first law of adequatism does not promise an easy life. It promises a manageable one. You stop waiting for the world to change. You change the point from which you engage with it. At some point, a quiet realization settles in. You no longer lose yourself inside situations. You stay present, grounded, clear. And this may be the greatest outcome of the first law. Not control over reality, but control over your relationship with it. Because when perception is distorted, every effort collapses. But when perception is clear, even complexity becomes navigable. So if we strip away the philosophy, the language, the theory, the first law of adequatism comes down to this: the ability to see. And the ability to see clearly is one of the rarest forms of strength in the modern world. Not because it makes you superior, but because it finally makes you honest with yourself first.